Hello, this is David Gottfried, and I'm going to give you my essay, which explains how the allegedly liberal media consistently pushes people to the right. Why it does this? Well, you'll have to ask yourself that question. But I'm going to explain first what the dynamic is, and then I'm going to give you 5 examples in 5 areas of political life which demonstrate how outfits such as the New York Times actually inculcate uh, a conservative point of view. Now, first, the general dynamic. Number one, the media is perceived to be liberal and does nothing to alter this perception. For example, the New York Times routinely endorses Democrats. Okay, number two, it publishes articles which ever so gently or sometimes heavy handedly argue in favor of a liberal position. Three, and this is the crucial thing, it makes its liberal arguments in an extremely weak, awkward, and fumbling manner. The New York Times is a doddering, old, liberal intellectual, devoid of syllogistic reasoning, whose only research source is a long list of fancy, smarty pants words. 4. The people reason. Man, the New York Times has just written another of its mealy-mouthed liberal articles. That article was a heap of junk, which argued in favor of liberal policy solutions. Since that liberal paper made such a bad case for its liberal position, the conservatives are probably right. In sum, the liberal media is really very conservative, but because it is thought of as liberal, but it makes a very, very bad case for the liberal position. Concrete examples. Number one, the FDA. I can remember some years back there was a New York Times article which said, in a typically liberal fashion, the FDA is not enforcing the law and is allowing purveyors of dangerous drugs and substances to get away with murder. That was the general statement the New York Times had to say. At the very same time, that article, this was maybe 15 years ago. I'm sorry, I'll give you more current examples. At the very same time, that article said that the FDA had just banned the sale of ephedra, which was killing some athletes. So the Times said 2 wholly inconsistent things. The article said, oh, the FDA is not doing its job and is letting companies sell bad products. But then it says that the FDA outlawed the sale of ephedra. Well, you finally get to the paragraph which clarified everything in like the 17th paragraph. The Times loves to do that. It's terribly long-winded, but the really critical stuff is at the very end. And in the 17th paragraph, the Times said the FDA banned the sale of ephedra after everyone stopped manufacturing it because they could no longer get liability insurance for it because they kept getting sued. So, most people who read that article did not have the energy to get to paragraph 17. So, the Times very simply just gave people one more reason to vote for a conservative Republican. Number two, searches and seizures. I can remember, well, this section was written in 2007. And I say here, within the past couple of months, the New York Times has written a couple of dozen articles bemoaning the Bush administration's getting all sorts of notices about from Facebook. I wish I didn't have such a jumpy computer screen. In any event, within the past couple of months, the New York Times has written a couple of dozen articles bemoaning the Bush administration's practice of conducting surveillance in the absence of warrants. Okay, so the New York Times, in its best and stodgy prose, suggestive of an old, befuddled, rich liberal eating tea and crumpets, or whatever old rich liberals are supposed to eat. The New York Times says that Bush is an extremely terrible person for wanting to conduct wiretaps and engage in other surveillance operations without search warrants. Now, most people reading this are going to get more conservative because they're going to say, shit, 9/11 just happened. 3,000 innocent people were killed. Do we really got to wait for a search warrant before we bust somebody's door down? That's what most people are going to say. All right? And the truth is, the New York Times is leaving something out. Because even when statutes say you have to get a search warrant, American jurisprudence has always understood that in the case of an emergency, the police are relieved of their obligation for getting a search warrant. All they got to do is, after they've done conducted the surveillance, all they got to do is submit an affirmation. I, Joe Schmo, a police officer, affirm that I believed that there was a clear and present danger to human life, and as such, there was no time to get a warrant. That's all you got to do. So the New York Times was really just shoving a lot of poppycock in our faces. That was ostensibly liberal, but had the effect of moving people to the right. The gray lady as Lady Bountiful. That's my third example, and this pertains to social services and transfer payments and aid to the poor. Incidentally, I should note the New York Times is often called the Gray Lady. Okay, the New York Times is a grand, drippy dowager with no paucity of words to discuss the plight of the poor. And like a grand, drippy dowager, she is brimming with sentiment, but quite short on the facts. The essential message regarding poverty comes down to this. The message of the New York Times. A, over the years, there have been innumerable programs to help the poor. B, billions of dollars have been spent. C, those evil Republicans want to cut spending. And D, we must, of course, always spend more and more money to help the poor. Now, this incites the reader to throw down the paper and exclaim, How can the New York Times claim that we must spend more to help the poor after having contended that we have already spent a ton of money? The New York Times, as usual, does a very poor job of elucidating the nature of these so-called liberal programs. One, they have not been giving that much aid directly to the poor. Much of the aid goes to people who purport to help the poor, social workers, psychiatrists, etc. And there are a multiplicity of programs that give many multiples of the aid given to the poor, to the middle class. The story is extensive, and I won't tire myself going into it here. I'll simply refer you to one of the greatest articles I ever read regarding political affairs in 20th century America. It's only 15 pages. I refer you to an essay entitled Bourgeois Liberalism, which is contained in Michael Harrington's work, The Twilight of Capitalism. In those 15 pages, he explains how almost every liberal democratic program from the time of Roosevelt down to the present day have not helped the poor that much, and really was seen to have been designed to assist the bourgeoisie. It's really great. He's concise. Now, what? But let me mention a few areas that the Times didn't cover. Correction, I don't mean a few areas that the Times didn't cover. I mean a few areas that Galbraith, that Harrington in bourgeois liberalism did not cover. Thank you. Like, for example, in the city of New York, if your landlord is charging you an excessive rent, you can complain to a city agency called the DHCR. They'll take, 10 years to look at your claim of a rental overcharge. Now, what in the intervening 10 years, you might fall behind on your rent, and the landlord might sue you for eviction. You will walk into the court and you will say, but they're overcharging me in my rent. And do you know what the landlord will argue and what the court will accept? The notion that you cannot complain of the rental overcharge in this court because you already complained about it in the DHCR. And so the DHCR has jurisdiction of your complaint of an overture, but the court doesn't. I mean, that's how a liberal agency, which is supposed to help the poor, makes everything fucking worse. The New York Times will create the impression that impecunious patients in New York City are giving a great deal because they get to go to New York's teaching hospitals. But they won't tell you how this all got started. You see, an agreement was made in 1963 between the New York City and the major teaching hospitals. The deal was this. The teaching hospitals would take care of New York's indigent patients. And in return, the teaching hospitals would get to sick their inexperienced and completely green interns on the patients. I mean, a lot of people say it's great to go to a teaching hospitals because brilliant doctors teach there. Yeah, but are you going to see the brilliant doctor or are you going to see the intern? And sorry if I seem too excitable, but I've known people who died under suspicious circumstances, and I get very angry. Well, in any event, I would say that in New York City hospitals, in the teaching hospitals, a sort of Berlin Wall exists between those portions of the hospital which treat people who are middle class and rich, and those parts of the hospital that treat the poor. Okay, I'll leave out the section on disability. I'll just mention one thing here. It just infuriates me all the time. I can't get over it. In 1994, George Pataki challenged Mario Cuomo and won the governor's race in New York State. I can remember distinctly that Pataki said that the poor were getting way too much. He said, wow, I mean, Medicaid, he said, was even paying for hair transplants for poor people who had lost their hair. Now, this was complete nonsense. I mean, I knew a dentist, and when he treated a Medicaid patient and put in a filling, Medicaid gave him a grand total of $2 per filling. Believe me, Medicaid never paid for hair transplants for poor people. But Pataki said it, and newspapers quoted Pataki as saying this, and many of those newspapers didn't bother to state that Pataki was just making up bullshit as he goes along. 4. Another example, the congressional pantomime and aid to the countries. In the early 80s, Congress voted not to give any aid to the countries, and the press reported on this. And this created the following impression: there is a vigorous left in this country. Indeed, this vigorous left is so powerful, it impedes and derails Reagan administration foreign policy, which wanted to aid the countries. And people also said, well, the left always complains that it's being bossed around and belittled and that it's powerless. But the people went on to conclude, but the left must be full of it because the left, through Congress, has just voted to ban all aid to the countries. Well, the thing is, there's just something that the media left out. What Congress did had nothing to do with aid would still went to the countries even in the face of the congressional prohibition. And I'm not talking about Iran-Contra. That was eventually disclosed. I'm talking about something else. You see, there are many states that have to do whatever America says. Okay? They are client states of America. Israel has only one friend, America, and Israel does a lot of America's dirty work, and thereby loses the support of half the world. Most Americans don't know anything about this, but in any event, client states of the United States, including Israel and Egypt and Saudi Arabia, gave money to the countries. So whether Congress voted to ban aid to the countries really didn't matter. Okay, 5, I'm going to talk about the consistent distortions of history of the past 100 years. And some people have said my talks are too long, so I'll try to speed it up. But I just want to give you examples to substantiate my position. Now, the allegedly liberal media routinely discusses the 1960s. Okay, they'll give us documentaries, or if they're not giving us a documentary, they'll talk about it at length. Okay? And they will always, and they will not always, they will usually portray liberal left-wing student and other demonstrators of the 60s as being idealistic and rebellious and philanthropic and all of that stuff. But at the same time, they'll portray them as being really sort of stupid and sort of gullible and sort of as if they were delusional from LSD. So what they really do is they make the student demonstrators and other demonstrators look quite ridiculous. And in this way, they push people to the right. And what I'm trying to get to is that most people have no idea of the history of the 60s, which does vindicate the left. And they don't know the history because the allegedly liberal media buries it. For example, they always show you footage of the they often show you footage of the 1968 Chicago Convention and the riots. They at least have the good decency to admit that it was a police riot. But they don't tell you why the students were so enraged. And they make the students appear to be just, hot-headed and hysterical. Now, we were enraged not only because the Vietnam War was absolutely terrible. We were enraged because of the theft that took place at the convention and that most people don't know anything about. This is the theft. In the spring Democratic presidential primaries of 1968, about 85% of the vote in all primary states put together went for the two candidates who were against the war in Vietnam, Bobby Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy. 85% of the vote were for the peace candidates. But at that fucking convention, 65% of the delegates supported that piece of shit, Hubert Horatio Humphrey, the vice president and Lyndon Johnson's asswipe. Humphrey once had a brave liberal record, but in the 60s, he was an utter piece of horseshit. And so that convention showed us in the starkest way possible that democracy was completely nullified in this country. For example, take the Pennsylvania primary. Eugene McCarthy won the Pennsylvania primary by 500,000 votes. Bobby Kennedy was not on the ballot in Pennsylvania. But you know what? At the convention, 90% of Pennsylvania's delegates went for Humphrey. Shortly before the convention, Bobby Kennedy was murdered, just like his brother. and stop telling me that we just are paranoid if we believe in conspiracies. I believe a lot of conspiracy theories are full of shit, but the Kennedys, I'm not sure about. Think of the single bullet theory of JFK, but I'm running far afield. And Gene McCarthy, who was the other anti-war candidate, was thoroughly derided and ridiculed as a pinko intellectual communist crackpot. And regarding that war, let me just say, and they don't tell you this, the liberal media, when they discuss the history of that miserable time, that by the latter part of 1967, the U.S. military was killing 1,000 civilians per week. So you're going to ask me, what are your sources? Are you getting it from some crackpot communist? I will tell you my sources, and you can find it on YouTube. More specifically, Robert Kennedy said that the U.S. military was killing 1,000 innocent civilians per week on either Face the Nation or Meet the Press in either November or December of 1967. Go to YouTube, you'll see it. You'll hear Robert Kennedy's eloquent denunciation of the war. He starts off slow and not too good, but keep listening, and he builds up to a glorious crescendo. I probably should, and there's more. The liberal media probably pushes people to the right when it says, well, we just couldn't win that war. Because most people think the liberal media is just belittling American might. And, America has about 8 times the population of Vietnam. America has an air force that's practically in the space age, and North Vietnam had hardly any planes at all. The idea that we couldn't win isn't why the war was wrong. The war was wrong because we were the wrong side. We were the bad guys. Please read the Pentagon Papers. Don't read stupid summaries of the war proffered by CNN. And I'm going to tell you that the liberal media can push people to the right because when it gives you its stupid documentaries which tell us about the recent history of the geopolitical history of the past 100 years. Because on the one hand, it says, we were unreasonably terrified of this Red Scare. But at the same time, it tells us that the communists were absolutely horrible. And the way in which they discuss the facts makes the communists seem quite horrible and makes their liberal analysis that we were unduly affected by the Red Scare seem preposterous. The problem is their factual analysis leaves out so much. We in this country repress the history of the 30s and the 40s as much as the Soviet Union repressed the history of Leon Trotsky. Let me get very specific. I'll give you one example, and I'll give you an article in the Times from 1938 that proves my point. Most people will consider the strongest evidence of Stalin's malignant nature to be the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939, in which Russia, which was supposedly Hitler's greatest enemy, suddenly entered into a non-aggression pact with Hitler, which led immediately to the start of World War II. But the West forgets to tell us that this was largely predicted. I refer you to the New York Times, October 11th, 1938. Read an article by Walter Duranty, who said, "The West has made so many concessions to Hitler that it appears as if the West has told Hitler, it's okay, Hitler, you can get strong, just so long as you keep beating up countries to the east. After all, the Western states hated communism just as much as Hitler did." Again, another fucking pop-up on my computer. Walter Duranty wrote that it seemed so obvious that Chamberlain and Hitler were in cahoots, because Chamberlain just kept saying yes to everything Hitler wanted, that Duranty said perhaps Stalin will try to preempt Chamberlain at this game of appeasement and make an agreement and make a non-aggression pact with Hitler. He predicted this in October of 38. And there's so much more I'd like to go into, but I've been advised that people don't like to listen to long videos. And I have more I want to tell. And by the way, Hitler's launch east consisted of a whole lot more than Munich. Okay, but you don't know that. Now, I should know that Walter Duranty, after the war, was criticized as a rig, as just a communist sympathizer. But many progressives were considered communist sympathizers after World War II. But more importantly, even if Walter Duranty had been not only a communist sympathizer, but also an agent of the Soviet Union, that would not detract from his political analysis, because his political analysis is based on objective facts. Yes, it is an objective fact that Chamberlain permitted Hitler to take Bohemia, to take the Sudetenland, and then Bohemia, Moravia, and then Memel, and then put pressure on the Polish corridor. This has gone on for quite some time. I hope I have been clear. And because it's so long, I'm not going to give you a conclusion. I should note in closing that this is part of a compendium of essays I wrote entitled Rants and Ruminations. I am David Gottfried, and it is copyright 2017. And have a good day. Goodbye.